Welcome back to the Human Perspective. We're continuing to bring you the voices of disabled people from the United States and around the world. Today we're in Chicago, Illinois at Access Living, which is one of the first 10 federally funded centers for independent living in the United States. We're speaking with advocacy leaders. Access Living, like other centers for independent living, is governed and staffed by a majority of people with disabilities. Joining us today is Amber Smock. Amber is currently the Director of Advocacy at Access Living. She oversees Access Living's disability policy, organizing, and public affairs at the local, state, and national levels. She started at Access Living in 2005 as an organizer working with people with disabilities. Amber was a co-founder of Feminist Response in Disability Activism, otherwise known as FRIDA, and is a member of the disability rights group ADAPT. Over the last year, she launched the strategic collaborative working group called Disability Power for Community Integration, which is playing a major role in the fight to save Medicaid. For our viewers from outside of the United States, Medicaid is an essential health care program funded by the federal and state governments, providing services to primarily low-income people with disabilities, children, and adults. She's been honored many times for her advocacy work. For our audience to know, we have a sign language interpreter off camera to translate between spoken English and American Sign Language. Welcome, Amber.
Thank you.
It's really a privilege to get to talk with you. Just so that you know, I'm quite biased towards Amber. She's been doing amazing work over a long period of time, but I've really gotten to know a lot more about her work this past year. So Amber, how long have you had your disability?
Well, my parents figured out that I couldn't hear when I was about 3.5 years old. So there's no particular reason why I seem to have a significant hearing loss. I just do. They figured it out by taking me first to one doctor who said that I had a cognitive disability. This was a common diagnosis at that time.
Cognitive meaning?
Well, meaning that I would be slow to learn, that I would be developmentally delayed, etc. My parents knew what the developmental benchmarks were and knew that I was hitting them. So they said, we need to get a second opinion, took me into a doctor who gave me a speech test and a hearing test, and that doctor figured out that I had a severe hearing loss. They also found out that I could lip read at that time, and how they did that was the doctor turned to me and asked, without voice, what are you doing today? And I said, we're going to go buy some ice cream. And so they knew that I already had some lip reading skills, and from there I got hearing aids, and I was mainstreamed into schools. I lip read, I had some note takers in college, but it really wasn't until college that I found the disability rights movement.
So when did you start learning sign language?
I started learning sign language around age 19 because at that time I was just starting to learn about the deaf community and deaf culture, deaf arts. And I thought, well, I really should try to learn some of this. And luckily near my college, UC Berkeley, there was a community college program called Vista. And Vista had very cheap ASL classes. So I went ahead, paid $50 for one semester and started learning ASL. But I was very lucky when I came to Access Living because in order to become more fluent in ASL, you really need to be immersed. The first day that I started working at Access Living, 4 of the deaf staff came right up to my desk and said, we're going to teach you sign language. So I had lunch friends every single day after that, and that's how I began really learning and being able to use sign language on a daily basis.
So do you consider yourself fluent in sign language now?
At this point, yes. I'll never be fluent the way people who grew up using sign language will be, but I can use it for work. It's what makes conference calls possible, meetings possible, communication with family and friends possible. I wouldn't be where I was now without sign language.
Thank you. So how and why did you get involved in the disability rights movement?
Okay. Well, when I was growing up, I was very disconnected from anything that resembled disability rights. My parents were good advocates for me, but I don't think we were connected with the wider community.
Why?
I think because I grew up in a suburban high school district outside of San Diego, California, and nobody really had a conversation about rights and a rights-bearing attitude. It wasn't until I decided to attend UC Berkeley that I started discovering protest movements and resistance. In fact, the first classes that I signed up for at UC Berkeley included classes like peace studies and protest movements of the 1960s. So that's where I started learning about resistance. But I also applied for a job when I was a sophomore in college, and this job was working for the UC Berkeley Bancroft Library's Disability Rights Movement collection. And I was an assistant archivist for that collection. And what they were doing was they were collecting the papers and paraphernalia of historic disability rights figures who were donating their items to UC Berkeley. And the first day that I started working there, they handed me a box full of papers that were drafts of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And that box belonged to a woman who was famous for marshaling the congressional effort to pass the Americans with Disabilities Act, and her name was Pat Wright. So I was being told as a 19-year-old with zero understanding of the Americans with Disabilities Act, here's a bunch of papers, and you better figure out which ones are important to save, and then put the rest of them in the trash. So what I had to do was give myself a crash course on disability history, disability rights, the disability movement, and understand how to organize this thing. And it turned out that I was obsessed with disability history. Yes, I had an official major. My major was a double major in English and art. But I constantly talked all the time to my friends about disability history and disability perspective. And so that's how I bit into the hook for disability rights.
When were you at Berkeley?
When was I at Berkeley? I graduated in 2000, so 1996, 2000.
Okay.
Yeah, post 88. Yeah.
Very exciting times. So you did this really good work in Berkeley. You were learning about disability rights. You were getting immersed in a community that had been very active in the 504 demonstration of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the first Center for Independent Living being in Berkeley. So when you left California, were you interested in continuing to work in the area of disability?
Well, I happened to leave California because I got hired by the U.S. Department of Education through a federal initiative for interns with disabilities. So I was placed at the Office of Management in the Department of Education. I had the most boring internship ever because it was basically files and data management, etc. But I made friends with the man who did ADA compliance and 504 compliance for the department. He told me about a job opening with a woman who was the communications manager for the special ed division. She had a physical disability, so she needed an executive assistant / personal assistant. So I went to work for her for 9 months.
Who was that?
Juliet Riso.
Oh, I know Juliet.
Yes. So I worked for Juliet for 9 months, and that was my first experience where everywhere we went, we had to have access for her and access for me.
Juliet is a wheelchair rider.
So when we would have to have physical access and we would have to have communication access. And that was my first experience with understanding what disability solidarity, cross-disability solidarity really looks like in practice on an everyday basis.
That's a great story. In the work that you've been doing over the last 6 months, first explain a little bit what the work is that you have been doing, and then a little bit of information about its impact.
Okay, so I have my feet, my fingers, in a variety of roles. So I stay engaged on disability policy. As a member of ADAPT, I've been very active in direct action and protests. I'm also involved with public affairs, media, communications. To me, the most important thing is making sure that people understand what is going on around them so that when problems come up, they can engage. Over the last 6 months, what's been happening is that we've had a crisis in the United States in terms of a giant shift in the federal outlook on what healthcare is supposed to mean for Americans across the spectrum. So when the election happened in November of 2016, like many people, I was surprised and caught off guard. But just a few weeks later, it became more and more apparent that we were going to face threats to Medicaid in particular. And I thought, well, what can we do? Because Medicaid is a state-by-state program. Each state has a different way that they run Medicaid. There's some oversight from the federal level, but what are we going to do? How do we harness the power of what I know to be great and effective advocacy at the state level with the strategic direction and dealing with politics that happens at the federal level? So I started talking with some other colleagues who work in Medicaid, home and community-based services advocacy, and we launched a working group called Disability Power for Community Integration. And the purpose of this working group is to keep federal and state advocates connected, sharing information about what's happening in terms of like what's going on behind the doors, what's happening publicly, what do we have to forecast for, who do we have to educate, getting good information flowing to and from the states and DC. And so what's interesting about Disability Power for Community Integration is it includes not just the policy people, it is also the media people, it is also the direct action people. It is all of those sectors all together who have come to an agreement that Medicaid home and community-based services is something that we care about, and we are going to pursue a multiple-pronged strategy in order to address any threats and to fight to widen and expand these where we can. So that's what Disability Power for Community Integration is doing. It is part of the work that's helped defeat the Graham-Cassidy bill. Many people within that working group were present in the protests, the direct actions. A lot of them got arrested. It's doing whatever it takes to make sure that people have the freedom to live in their own homes where they want to live.
We will put up a website for you to go for ADAPT, where you can see many of the demonstrations, and also for our viewing audience, we'll put a link up to a woman named oh my goodness gracious, C-SPAN, not C-SPAN, MSNBC.
Oh,
Rachel Maddow, sorry. So that you can also see that her program, which is a nationally renowned program, did a whole piece on ADAPT. Do you think the activities that you've been involved in over the last 6 months have not only been successful, but have also helped change people's views about disability as an integrated part of healthcare discussions?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that it used to be nobody cared about Medicaid. Nobody thought Medicaid was an issue. People thought Medicaid was for people who just wanted to drain the system. Now people understand that Medicaid affects middle-class families. They understand that Medicaid affects the ability to get out of bed and feed yourself in the morning. They understand that Medicaid funds critical life-saving services that people need every day. But those stories have always been there. It's just that we finally had the time and the moment and the organizing to bring this to light and to make this high profile across the United States. So in a way, the crisis has been a blessing.
So once again, we've completed our more than 10 minutes at this point, and I'd like to thank you very much, Amber. This is another program that could go on really for a couple of hours, but I'd like to thank you all for joining us. And if you wish to learn more about the community organizing that's been happening in the United States and the successful defeat of 3 attempts to weaken legislation in the United States by educating legislators and getting community-based people involved, we'll share some information about how to do that. Please continue the discussion in the comments section below, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel, The Human Perspective, and hit the like and share button on this video. Thank you for joining The Human Perspective, and we look forward to our next discussion.
You're just gonna pick it up.
Yep. We'll edit it out.
It's still